Video 29, Panama. This is the last video in the series. Thank you for staying with me all this time. If you have enjoyed it 10 times as much as I have, you're pretty bored by now. And I know I'm not the best of lecturer on videos. I'm pretty good, au naturel, but I don't know how to come across on this media, and I don't know how to make a video. So I hope one day to be able to get finance to produce a proper series in a professional studio. Now, in this video, you are once more going to see that other side of me as a storyteller. As nobody wanted to listen to my thoughts on drug policy in my native Sweden, I instead ventured out on an all those things a person should have done projects. One of all those things was to become an athlete, a second to become a fiction writer, and a third to travel 200 countries. Against that background, please imagine a much bigger, much stronger, and unfortunately better looking version of myself strolling down Panama's Avenida Central in the early evening of the 9th of August 1992. My tale, though probably unconsciously tainted by my defense mechanisms, blurred recollections, and a desire to show myself off as a better human being than I really am, is, to the best of my recollection, true. Chapter 1. The Shooting. It was about 3 years after the Americans, in Operation Just Cause, had disposed of General Noriega, whom I believed now sat imprisoned in a Miami jail. As to myself, I was in the process of complying with the, in many respects quite insane, resolution to visit all these countries, and in order to survive this and some other even sillier things that I also had resolved to do, I had, totally legally, by sweat and pain rather than steroids and testosterone, made myself big and strong. Over 130 kilos big and strong, to be precise, and at the time there was not much excess fat among those kilos. Suddenly, from behind, I felt 2 hands entering the front pockets of my trousers, and, as neither of these hands belonged to myself, I swiftly grabbed hold of the wrists attached to them and threw myself onto the ground. My assailants came tumbling down along with me. They had little choice but to, and as I felt how the wrist that I held onto by my left hand relaxed, letting go of its grip of my hotel keys that it had held onto, I let the wrist go, and as I did, the hand attached to it swiftly removed itself from my pocket and disappeared. I then started to roll, figuring that this would make kicking me, throwing knives at me, or shooting me harder for the owner of the released wrists, something that is likely to have caused much pain to my remaining assailant, especially as I rode over him, each time sort of pushed my weight down onto him in order to cause him as much discomfort as possible. The noises he made corroborated that I indeed had been successful in the implementation of this strategy. Though more persistent than his companion, this hand too eventually let go of its hold that had been around my wallet. As it did, I loosened my own grip, and in a flash the second hand too was gone. I had not seen the face of any of my 2 assailants. So there I lay on the ground, slightly shaken but not too stirred, while a crowd was gathering, thinking about things like whether I was hurt or not, whether I ought to report what had just happened, whether some bonny lassie had seen me defend myself so valiantly. possible police trouble with former Noriega employed officers, and whether I was bleeding. I checked no blood and thus no risk of HIV, etc. And though one of my trouser legs had been ripped, I appeared to be physically undamaged. I was just about to check for bonny lassies with admiring gazes when I heard a gunshot. I bounced up, if 130 kilos can bounce, and looked in the direction of the sound. 20 meters or so away, a cool-looking civilian, holding a handgun, smiled smartly but not altogether pleasantly at the rapid gathering crowd. Actually, he was sort of stealing my crowd, including one very bonny lassie, all while Clint Eastwood-like blowing at what might have been smoke coming out of the barrel. I could not see. He never gave me his name, nor does it appear in the police report, but let me for the sake of convenience refer to him as Sean the shooter. Then I looked in the direction that both the shooter and the crowd were looking, and there I detected a wobbling little man, the man whom I assumed had been shot, and the man I therefore concluded must have been one of my assailants, probably the one whose wrist I had let go of last. I never learned his name either, nor does it appear in the police report, but let me, again for the sake of convenience, refer to him as Victor the victim. As I aggressively made my way towards my assumed assailant, Victor the victim wobbled and started what eventually would become a total collapse onto the ground. Meanwhile, the man with the gun had stopped blowing at it, yet he showed no intention of putting it back into its holster. The crowd, that seemed to keep their distance to Sean the shooter, only, or at least partly, because of his gun, soon with one voice started to shout, apparently for my benefit, "No fue él, no fue él," which is Spanish and means it wasn't him. At this point, I would very much have liked to be able to state that I felt disgusted. Disgusted by the shooter's inappropriate smile, his smoke blowing, and especially by the fact that he had just shot a man who had done me no other harm than trying to rob me, and by so doing had given me a good tale, and, if the crowd was to be trusted, not even that. Victor the victim pressed his hands onto where the bullet had entered. It was somewhere in the middle of his body, but to my shame I did not register precisely where, or whether there was any exit wound or not. And it was only later that I started to reflect over whether the man was likely to have survived or not. If Victor the victim received swift and proper treatment, my guess is that he did, but in retrospect I would not give more than 2-1 against him dying. These thoughts only suggested themselves much later, and as I moved towards my assumed assailant, I was motivated to do so mainly by the desire to detain him, and possibly with the intention of inflicting upon him just a wee bit of additional harm. My feelings towards the shooter, however, were 100% positive, and I was filled with something not all that far removed from euphoria. I had survived another attack on my persona, and for virtually the first time, the bugger who had tried to harm me had gotten his comeuppance. I do not even recall what happened to the wounded little man after he collapsed. I did not hit him. Of course I did not. Nor can I recall how we got to the first police station. Sean the shooter, who indeed had declared himself to be the plainclothes detective that I had suspected him of being, argued his case with a pleasant-sounding and intelligent-looking uniformed officer inside the police station. An officer that for some reason seemed to trust neither Sean the shooter or myself. He didn't like that Sean was trying to report the case. It seemed to me that the disliking officer, again for some reason I never really understood, did not want to register the report, and I assumed that's why we eventually had to continue to a second police station. As we left, me in tow, the officer who apparently had refused to cooperate whispered to me, Atención, Noriega, peligro, which means beware, Noriega, danger. I took that as a warning, and that the detective I was about to follow used to work for the ex-president, probably in some drug-related capacity, as the ex-president now was incarcerated in the US for drug crimes, and that I had better watch out. I cannot claim that I remember what the first police station looked like, other than that it was up some stairs and seemed normal enough. Yet this second station immediately made a lasting impression. Very scary, very surreal, and as if out of another world. A corrupt, hard, impatient, sordid, smoky, unforgiving, yet morally superior, no nonsense, firmly rule governed, not to be questioned, overwhelming, self justified, and self justifying world. There were lots of desks, and everybody seemed to be clinging on, having an intimate, physical even, relationship to these desks. The people, all detective I assumed, were not normally positioned in front of their desks, but rather on top of them, sitting or beside them, leaning against them, conjuring up in my mind the image of a swarm of cockroaches invading a doll's house. Everybody seemed to be smoking cigarettes, yet it was as if nobody inhaled, and just being in the room was as if I had been smoking myself. A habit I had reluctantly kicked 4 or 5 years earlier, so that particular part of the experience I actually enjoyed. Chapter 2, The Station. Everybody's gender was male, and it was not a sort of place where the presence of a woman would have felt natural, other than as a victim, hardly even possible. It was an utterly male-dominating environment, oozing of chauvinism, sexism, patriarchy, machismo, corruption, a bit of homosexuality, and the testosterone. A big, not very dirty and thus much brighter square on the wall behind one of the desks marked where something, presumably a photo or possibly a painting, must have hung until quite recently. I had no problem imagining General Noriega looking down at me from above with a patriarchic smile. My guess is that there were about 12 desks in total, and Sean directed me to a chair placed in front of the one just right of the strangely clean, white and well-lit passageway through which we had entered the room, to the desk directly beneath the bright square on the wall. Though it by now had started to wear off, I was still on a bit of an adrenaline high, and, though or since I had not given much thought to it, if any, to the fate of Victor, the victim, or the warning I had been given, I still felt great. Inside the office the smoke was so heavy and the light so bad that I could only barely see the faces of the men clinging to their desks at the back of the room. Yet there was little doubt that I was the center of attention, but as my size normally saw to that, I made little of it. Then I recalled what the officer at the other station, the one who had refused to register our complaint, had whispered, "Beware, Noriega, danger." And I looked around once more before I sat down in front of the desk beneath the bright square on the wall to wait for somebody to come and take my statement. For the first time that evening, I felt ill at ease. I had not talked to Sean the shooter since he had guided me to the desk, but I assumed that I had been taken to his home station, because here people seemed to recognize and to treat him in a much more comradely manner. Through the smoke, I could make out how he, laughing and gesticulating at the other side of the room, leaning against the desk, demonstrated to what I assumed to be his colleagues how he had put a bullet into Victor the victim. He put his hand on my shoulder, gave me a thumbs up, together with a somewhat strained smile, as he a little later left the smoke-filled room through the strangely bright and well-lit hallway. A bit like an Icarus making his way out of the clouds and towards the sun. And that was the last I saw of Sean the shooter. Chapter 3. Interrogation. Just the vibes emitted by the officer who eventually arrived to take my statement would have been enough to send the Dirty Harry asking for early retirement. The man was possibly the jefe de la División de Delitos contra la Propiedad de la Policía Judicial de Panama, but I am not certain. He was at least a decade older than myself, and probably less than half my size, yet he appeared 10 times scarier than I could ever hope to. In front of me sat what came across as a totally soulless being. A man who was no respecter of lives other than his own, and for the first time that evening I felt truly frightened. "Good evening, senor. Welcome to Panama." "Hi, I'm Andre." This man, who neither presented himself nor shook my hand, in addition to look scary, had an uncanny knack of making his subtext speak. Thus when, for instance, a verbatim translation would have read, "And how many were they?" what the subtext said was, "Are you really sure you want to say that?" And when he commented, "Now that is really interesting," what he really said was, "Do you really not even want to make an effort to get out of this?" This subtext ability was so amazing that time and time again I found myself answering to it rather than to the words the man had actually spoken. He must have been used to that, because he did not seem surprised, nor did he seem to care what I answered, nor, for that matter, whether I answered. Because after a while he simply wrote down the answers he figured I ought to have given him. At least that is what I figured he did, and I felt ever more ill at ease, ever more frightened. As the fish-eyed little man finished typing down the description of what he figured I should sign, and pulled the duplicates out of the typewriter, he knew who I was, that I was traveling alone, which hotel I stayed at, that I knew nobody in Panama, that nobody knew that I was here, my parents' names. He claimed that he had read one of my father's novels, my uncle Jacinto, and he even knew of the child prodigy, Pablito Calvo, who had starred in the movie. But not even that made him seem less unpleasant, as well as my mother's address and telephone number. He knew that I was a writer, a narcotics researcher, and even about my All the Things project. As he started to read what he had written, I realized that I did not even know his name. Yet I was so scared that I was fully prepared to sign the totally fictitious account that he no doubt had prepared for me. I was prepared to sign that there had been 4 men, that they all had attacked and beaten me, that I had been able to identify them all and match their faces to their names, that one of the men had stolen my wallet, that I later recognized this man as the one who had attacked both myself and the detective, the same man whom the detective had shot in self-defense and in order to defend me from again being attacked and in order to return my wallet, or something like that. This, of course, was nothing but lies, but there was something about the way that I was made to perceive the situation. The first officer's warning, the station, the missing Noriega photo, the heavy smoke, the way the officers crawled around their desks, cockroach-like, Sean's departure, the strangely white and celestial-like hallway, the bright spot on the wall, and all the subtext that made it seem as if I was wrong, my interviewer right, and as if I somehow should be grateful that they at all bothered to take any notice of my pitiable existence. I cannot explain this feeling because I am not clever enough, neither at psychology nor at expressing myself. But whoever has read Kafka's The Trial might understand, and the quote from the book suddenly struck me. Someone must have translated Joseph K., for without having done anything wrong, he was arrested one fine morning. Then, as the man who was maybe the jefe de la división prepared to hand over the papers for me to sign, papers that once signed no doubt would have been advantageous to the corrupt ex-minions of General Noriega and quite possibly serious disadvantageous to Victor the victim and his alleged partners. I got a second chance. I got a second chance to behave like a proper and honorable human being, a chance that, considering what I had been prepared to do, I probably did not deserve. The officer seemed to discover that he had turned at least one of the carbon papers the wrong way around, and with a curse he ripped the papers out of the machine, muttered something seriously derogatory about somebody's ancestry, threw the papers into the garbage bin, and stormed out of his office as in a rage. That was the last I saw of the first soulless subtext man. I took a few deep breaths, steadied myself, and I even somehow managed to make conscious the unpalatable truth that whatever I would sign could well have consequences beyond my own well-being. What have I this done to be put in this insane situation? I asked myself. After a few minutes, another man, again apparently a senior officer, appeared through the shining white celestial passageway. His skin was sickly grey, his face scarred from what I assumed must have been a pimply youth, his eyes bloodshot, his hair thin. You'll be dead within a year, I thought. His eyes were nearly as fish-like as his predecessors, and I reflected that he could well have been my first interviewer's elder brother. The officer, with a sigh, plunged down in the chair in front of me so heavily that the ash fell from his cigar and onto his lap. Machine-like, he flicked it off his trouser leg. This one was scary too, and though he might not have pushed Dirty Harry into early retirement, the man in all likelihood would have had Harry asking for at least a few weeks off, and again I felt ill at ease. Yet not as ill as I had felt a little while ago. I never got this man's name either, nor does it occur on the police report, other than possibly as 3 initials. Nevertheless, his questions were straight, and when I answered them truthfully, it appeared to me as if he wrote down more or less what I was answering. However, though not as strong as before, both the soullessness and the subtext of his predecessor were still there. And when he answered my "How could I never saw the men who tried to steal my wallet" with a simple "I see," it felt as if he really said, "Let us get this charade over and done with, so that we can get rid of you and get back to doing something useful." This, them intending to get rid of me, however, still seemed beyond the realm of possibility. They could not do that, could they? Yet for the first time I started to fear for my life. The officer gave me a thin, sardonic smile. "You realize they will come after you, don't you?" "Come after me? Who? The detective? You?" "Of course not. The 3 friends of the thief that that our man saved you from." "Saved? Why? Why should I?" "You're a witness now. I am sure they will be waiting for you. Maybe they are already at your hotel." The man took on a serious demeanor as he looked down at his report, but then smiled as he looked up. "Hotelleria Sol. I know the manager very well. Buys me cigars all the time. From Cuba. But they have no reason to harm me." The senior officer smiled pleasantly. "And they don't know where I live." Next will be chapter 4, but that will be in the next video. So I make a break here.